Gina, a young editor of the fashion magazine Runway, was moving her personal belongings to a new apartment. In order to buy the apartment, Gina had to take out a large mortgage, but she didn't regret it one bit. As Gina entered the elevator, she saw a short, elderly woman. The woman asked Gina if she was moving into apartment 1004. Did she know that her neighbors were a male couple? Not that Gina was embarrassed by the news, but it was rather unusual to know that a male couple lived next door. The woman said the young men were quite handsome, tall, but asked Diana not to be deceived as they are in an intimate relationship with each other. The woman also told Gina that that male couple had a child together. Then she ended the conversation by wishing the girl good luck and happy moving in. Gina glanced at the neighboring apartment. Whoever lives in it, one should still get to know them, since they are her neighbors, and neighbors should be kept on good terms. Gina was awakened by the ringing of her alarm clock. She looked at the time and realized she was already late. Gina called a cab and asked the driver to get her to work as quickly as possible. Gina flew to her workplace. There was no way she was going to be late today. They had a new editor-in-chief starting today. If the new editor found out that Gina was late, she was finished. He used to work at a very cool publishing house and was the director of the fashion department there. He was known for his cool demeanor and stern personality. Gina didn't know what he looked like. All she was told was the name of the new editor-in-chief, David Sheen. "What time do you think it is?" asked Gina by her co-worker Marie. Gina glanced toward the editor-in-chief's desk. Luckily, he wasn't there. There was a chance that no one would notice her lateness. Gina asked Marie if she had been able to communicate with the new editor-in-chief. Marie admitted to her that she hadn't even been able to introduce herself to him because of her excitement. Marie noticed that Gina was dressed rather modestly, and her head wasn't styled. She asked the girl if she was in her right mind. What was wrong with her? Gina admitted that she hadn't settled into her new place yet. She had the impression that she wasn't moving into her new home, but that she was being thrown out of it. A stately, tall man entered the office. He said that the latecomer needed to go to the conference room. Gina gingerly made her way up to the top floor. Although she didn't get a good look at the new editor-in-chief, she realized from his voice that he was quite cold. Suddenly, a memory came over Gina. She dropped her notebook and pen from her hands. Marie asked Gina, "What have you already happened?" "Unless I'm delusional, the editor-in-chief is standing right in front of me," flashed through Gina's mind. It was the man she had met 3 months ago in Paris. In Paris, this man had saved Gina from a pickpocket. As Gina was admiring the beauty of the city, she didn't notice the thief coming up behind her. The thief undid the lock on Gina's backpack and took out all her documents. Luckily, the pickpocket didn't have time to escape. He was grabbed by the hand by a man unknown to Gina. The documents and wallet fell out of the pickpocket's hand onto the floor. The stranger picked up the documents and wallet from the floor and held them out to Gina. He said that he had never seen such a careless tourist carrying all the necessary documents and a wallet with money in his backpack. The stranger told her that he couldn't tell if she was naive, stupid, or all at once. He explained to her that backpackers usually carry all their documents in their breast pocket or in a purse that is in the front, and they prefer to carry all their cash closer to their body. Wow, he's so handsome. He must be an actor or a model. Without listening to the stranger, thought to herself Gina. Seeing the girl's stupor, the stranger took her hand and almost forcibly put her personal belongings into her palm. Without another word, the stranger continued on his way. "Just a minute," Gina called out to the stranger. Gina decided to thank the stranger for preventing the theft. The man asked Gina to be more careful. He said that life in today's society is not a roller coaster ride. There are many dangers. He then turned around and went about his business. Gina caught up with the stranger and grabbed his arm. "What is it again?" The stranger turned around indignantly. "Can I buy you something?" Gina asked him. Unexpectedly for Gina, the stranger said yes. 3 months ago, Gina spontaneously bought tickets to Paris. She found out about her boyfriend's infidelity, so she decided to get a little divorced to forget the pain he had caused her. The girl was extremely curious if the new editor-in-chief remembered what had happened in Paris. When the editor-in-chief looked towards Gina, their gazes met. The girl realized that David Sheen remembered her. Not that the girl was surprised by this fact. She just didn't know what would happen now. Gina stealthily scrutinized David. He was as handsome as she remembered him. Back in Paris, he had radiated elegance and nobility. The girl remembered how much she had enjoyed watching him when he was just having coffee on the terrace. Against the backdrop of Paris, its Eiffel Tower, The man looked especially beautiful. "Miss May." Gina heard her last name. She was confused, as she didn't think anyone would address her. Calling Gina by name was the new editor-in-chief. She turned to him, expecting a question. "Miss May, I have so many questions gathered for you. For example, do you always come to work this early?" David snapped. The girl had to admit to him that she had simply overslept. She sincerely apologized for what had happened. "You must be proud that you slept in today, and you should be ashamed of your outfit." David reprimanded Jean in front of everyone. There was an awkward pause at the table. Everyone was silent. Jean thought that David didn't look like himself today. He was completely different in Paris. Jean began to reassure herself that most likely David just didn't remember her. And the fact that they had been one-night stand lovers in Paris meant nothing. At this point, the man sitting at the head of the table was simply her boss. David Sheen asked where Jean's cell phone was. She replied that it was in her pocket. He asked her to get it out. David asked her to type "fashion editor" into a search engine and read loudly what it says. He asked her not to skip a single word. Based on the Internet Encyclopedia, a fashion editor has a great influence on current fashion trends. For this reason, the views and style sense of the editor has a decisive position. Jean read. David asked Jean to read the last sentence again. "For this reason, the views and style sensibilities of the editor have a decisive position," repeated Jean. "So do you think you are a fashion editor? Is your style decisive?" asked David another question. David stood and headed for the exit. As he passed Jean, he said in French in a low voice, "Look at you." Jean didn't understand the last sentence. She asked Marie to have her translate. Marie became embarrassed, not knowing what words to choose. "Well, how can I tell you? Well, I wouldn't say it's an insult. Honestly, I would translate it as, 'Look at you.'" Embarrassed, Marie replied. Walking across the parking lot next to their office, Jean thought about today. She never imagined that a one-night stand lover would one day be her boss. That only happens in soap dramas. It's impossible in real life. Suddenly, someone grabbed her elbow. It was David Sheen. With this action, he caught the girl off guard, which scared her a lot. "Miss May," David began to say, "I have one more question for you." "How did you feel when you ate it?" David asked a question that was completely incomprehensible to Jean. The girl even asked him again to make sure she hadn't heard him. David repeated the question, looking Jean in the eye. Jean absolutely did not understand the question. She asked again, what could she eat? David asked how could she eat his heart, and then leave him. The girl replied that she couldn't remember when she had done that. David said, "What do you mean she doesn't remember when she did that? When she left him in Paris?" The girl became convinced that he remembered her after all. David told her that of course he remembers everything. He has a photographic memory, so he's good at remembering faces. And even if you disregard his memory, he would remember the girl who dumped him anyway. Jin thought to herself that she had no other choice. Yes, she had left the room while he was still asleep. She had to go to work. And on top of that, she wouldn't be able to look him in the eye in the morning after making such a big mistake. "I apologize for not being able to say goodbye to you properly. I was just thinking that you would be reassured by the note I left you." Bowing her head, Jean replied, "Well, if you're talking about the note that said you had a good night and it was an unforgettable experience, then it conversely made me bitter. That note made me feel used," said David into her eyes. David turned around and walked away from the girl. Jean told him afterward that it wasn't at all what he thought it was, to which David replied to her that he was happy to see her anyway. David also said that he was happy to discuss the situation. "By the way, don't ever make a mistake in my presence again. I am extremely responsible for my job," said David without turning his head. "I only decided to warn you because of when we used to sleep together," he continued to say. Gin, on the other hand, replied to him that it wouldn't happen again. Gina was uncomfortable with this conversation, and after all, she remembered David completely different. All her memories of Paris came back to her in an instant. David asked Jean what she wanted to drink. The girl confessed to him that she didn't know about alcoholic drinks at all, so she relied completely on his taste. David asked the girl why then she had brought him to the bar if she didn't know about alcoholic beverages and didn't like them. They could have just had coffee. That would have been enough. The girl confessed to him that she had a long-standing desire to drink alcohol just like this in the evening with someone. David ordered light alcoholic cocktails for them. To avoid sitting in silence, Jean started asking the stranger what he was doing. David told her various things, nothing specific. Jean asked him why he wanted to seem so mysterious. David was surprised at the girl's words. She had to admit that she didn't understand why he didn't want to give his name or admit where he worked. David asked her why tell her anything if they were never going to see each other again. Jean admitted to him that she just wanted to find a topic of conversation. And since he wouldn't give any information about himself, there was nothing to talk about. David then suggested that Jean should just talk about herself. She would share interesting stories from her life with him. Jean asked him if she looked like a person who had a full and varied life. Unable to think of anything better, Jean told David about her boyfriend, his betrayal, how she unexpectedly bought tickets to Paris. When several glasses were already drunk, Jean moved closer to David and told him that she liked his cologne very much, that it smelled quite good. David named the brand he uses. Jean replied to him that she knew the brand, that it was #1 on the top fragrances a girl likes on their boyfriends. "I guessed it! You're a womanizer!" exclaimed Jean excitedly. "No comment," David answered her. The girl entered the elevator, but then someone asked her to wait. It was her neighbor with his little daughter. He said thank you to the girl and asked his daughter to thank her as well. The little girl was quite cute, so she immediately took a liking to Jean. The girl noticed that the girl's dress was very pretty. The girl confessed that this blue dress was bought for her by her daddy. The neighbor was also quite cute. "I guess this family has a good heredity. They're both handsome," Jean thought to herself. The neighbor was extremely interesting to Jean. She began to analyze his age. The girl was about 5 years old. Did the neighbor really marry so young? After all, he looks very young. The girl decided to ask the neighbor if it was true that he was in a gay couple. The neighbor was embarrassed by the question. The situation was diffused by his daughter. She turned to the neighbor and asked him if daddy was coming soon. Jean realized that this girl really did have 2 fathers. The girl noticed that she had embarrassed the neighbor with her question. She asked him not to think anything unnecessary. She is not homophobic and takes everything absolutely normally. Jean admitted to the neighbor that he and his daughter look pretty cool. Therefore, in any case, she will cheer for them. The neighbor absolutely did not understand for whom she will cheer for. What is going on in this house? The guy didn't have time to ask Jin these questions. His cell phone rang. "Hey David, when will you be home?" asked the young man to someone on the other end. "Hello, my sweet little bastards. How are you two doing? How are you doing?" asked Jessica. She was the deputy editor. Her subordinates answered her with a cheer. They were happy to see her. "What happened during my absence? You look rather tired. What happened?" Jessica continued to ask. "Happened? Oh, nothing really happened. It's just that everyone was freaked out after the first meeting. They were trying not to show their faces to the editor-in-chief, working up a sweat." Jean thought to herself. Jessica recognized that the editor-in-chief was in place and hurried to go say hello to him. Jessica knocked on the door of the editor-in-chief's office. Without waiting for an answer, she entered the office. David stood leaning against the desk, the latest issue of their magazine in his hands. "Wow, he looks like a model!" Jessica's mind raced. Jessica walked over to David, extending her hand for a handshake. They introduced themselves to each other, exchanging pleasantries. Jessica decided to compliment her boss. She confessed that she was happy to work with him and hoped to learn a lot from him. To which David modestly replied that he still knew little enough to learn from him. Jessica marveled at the decoration of the hall. It looked gorgeous. The view from the window was stunning. "I wonder how rich our boss is to hold a welcome party in a place like this. Or is he used to such luxury at his previous workplace where he was the editor-in-chief of a fashion magazine in France?" asked Jessica aloud. Gina replied to her that she didn't know her manager's income, and in addition, any luxury could be used to. She apologized and went out to the ladies' room. Jessica asked that one not to linger as she didn't want to be alone for long. Jean pulled her cell phone out of her pocket. Distracted by the phone, Jean didn't notice the boy running at her. He crashed into her at full speed. The child didn't stay on his feet and fell on his back, raising a loud cry. "Oh baby, I'm sorry." Jean reached her arms out to the baby. Jean took the baby in her arms and started rocking from side to side to calm him down. But she miscalculated her strength a little and began to roll onto her side. Someone's strong arm picked her up from behind. It was David. David took the baby from her. He asked the boy what his name was. He began to ask the child where he was hurting. He began to soothe the child in a quiet voice. Jean watched all of this from the sidelines. She wondered how the editor-in-chief managed to find common ground with the child so easily. The girl decided that he probably had children. The child's parents approached. David put the baby in their hands, saying that he found no visible injuries. David walked toward the hall, Jean following him. She thought he was going to give her a hard time. The girl turned out to be right. "You know, it's sad to see you make excuses for the first impression you made on me in Paris." The girl replied that she understood his feelings perfectly. She apologized wildly for the blunder she had committed. "Of course you are not sorry. You have done nothing since yesterday not to disappoint me." David finished off an already depressed and frustrated Jean. "I thought I asked you not to make any more mistakes in front of me." David added that Jean was walking on thin ice. She should have been more careful. At the table, John thought about the fact that she does look clumsy in David's eyes. He sees her in an unattractive light all the time. When everyone had had a few drinks and the table was less formal, Stephen got up from the table and asked David if he had a girlfriend. David answered in his usual manner. He asked Stephen why he was asking this question in a public meeting. Would the answer help improve his performance at work? Stephen and Jessica decided to diffuse the situation somehow. They admitted that such questions would not help them in their work, but would help them get to know their supervisor better. Stephen and Jessica tell David that they have a pretty friendly team. They see nothing wrong with asking personal questions. They apologize if they hurt his feelings, because maybe he thinks differently. David wondered if they thought that if it was their custom to talk about themselves, he would have to adapt to them and adopt their behavior. But still, David decided to admit that he didn't have a girlfriend. That's not surprising. With a character like that, what kind of girl would agree to be with him? Jean thought to herself. David decided not to stay in debt. He asked Stephen at what time he lost his virginity. Jessica and Jean were stunned by this question. There was a dead silence. David said he didn't understand the embarrassment of the staff, because he too wanted to get to know each employee better. Jean's cell phone rang. She saw the number pop up and was wildly reluctant to pick it up. She just sat there staring at the ringing phone. "Miss May, don't you want to answer the phone?" David asked. "No, just someone got the wrong number." Jean answered him. "Bernard, how long are you going to keep bugging me? I told you not to call me." Jean was indignant as she was getting another call from her ex-boyfriend. Bernard replied to her that he was hurt by her words. He doesn't understand why she is being so rude to him. Jean was outraged. Bernard cheated on her and asks why she's being rude. Jean tells Bernard that she doesn't want to talk to him. She wants to forget the whole thing as soon as possible, and he keeps calling her and rubbing her soul. Jean asked Bernard not to call her anymore and said she was hanging up. Someone's hand took the phone from her palm. David put Jean's phone to his ear and said, "Will you stop bothering her? Who are you? It doesn't matter, just tell me where you are." Jean could hear Bernard yelling into the phone. "Why do you want to know who I am? And why do you want to come here? We're actually at the Love Hotel." David calmly answered him. "At the Love Motels? What on earth are you doing there?" Bernard continued to shout. "What do you think we can do here?" Once again, David replied coldly. "Who the hell are you anyway? And why are you sleeping with Jean?" Bernard wondered. "I'm her boyfriend," David answered him. "Boyfriend?" Now it was Jean's turn to be surprised. David continued. He told Bernard not to call here again, and if he did, he would risk his life. "You miserable piece of—" shouted into the phone Bernard, but David didn't want to hear the continuation, so he hung up. "Why are you talking to this trash? He's not worth wasting your precious time on him." Without understanding the look, David said, "Don't you want your cell phone back?" David's voice brought Jean out of her stupor. She realized that she had been sitting there for a minute just staring at one point. "I'm going to lose my mind soon. Why do I always have to bail you out?" asked David, handing Jean her cell phone. He then turned around and walked away without giving the girl a chance to answer. 163. Jean's mind kept going over and over David's words. She was thrilled that he called her his girlfriend. And by the way, why did he think he had to save her all the time? Jean thought back again to that night in Paris. After they'd had a few drinks, David had paid the bill. Jean was indignant because she was the one who had called him for a drink. The girl wanted to thank him for saving her. David offered to walk Jean back to her hotel. "Strange, but your manners are better than I thought," said Jean to David. David was surprised. He didn't understand what was wrong with his manners. Jean explained her words to him. She admitted to him that he looked like the town fop. Jean told David that he looked a lot like a gangster. He's very straightforward. He doesn't beat around the bush but makes his point directly. David asked her to just tell him what hotel she was staying at. He would take her there, and that would be the end of their acquaintance. To which Jean replied that maybe she didn't want to tell him where she was staying. "You didn't even tell me your name, so why should I tell you what hotel I'm staying at?" said Jean to him. "Fine, you don't have to tell me. I'm not that nosy." David wished her a happy stay, told her to continue to enjoy her vacation and return to her home in good spirits. May this trip bring her joy. David's silhouette began to dissolve into the crowd. "Okay, I agree." Jean ran after him. The hotel was a 10-minute walk away. Jean offered to take David up to her room. She really wanted to buy him a drink. She offered to buy him a drink, but this time she was paying. David leaned into her face and said in a quiet voice that she had already crossed the allowed line twice. That made him worry. "You are aware that rumors are already being spread about us, aren't you?" Dennis asked. "No. Well, it's understandable, because if two guys are living together, they're bound to be a gay couple." David answered him. "And on top of that, we have Victoria living with us," David continued. "I agree. Victoria calls us both dads for crying out loud," said Denise. "Victoria, from this day forward, call me uncle. I'm not your daddy," said Dennis. The little girl protested, saying he was her daddy and that was it. David took Victoria in his arms. He said he liked it when she called him daddy. Let the child decide who to call. "Okay, then what are you going to do about all the rumors?" Denise asked him. "Nothing. Let them say what they want to say." The meeting for the November issue of the magazine began. Everyone began to give their opinions. Some suggested going deeper into leopard print. Some had ideas for fur, and some suggested inviting a famous actress for a photo shoot. David said that all their ideas were ridiculous, that they need to move away from all this. They need to move on. Jean decided to talk about her idea. November is Firefighters' Day, so she suggested inviting them to talk about the intricacies and dangers of their job. David listened intently to Jean. She suggested taking a picture of the firefighters against the backdrop of a fire. Jean thought that this way they could make a special issue, tips from which would help people prevent tragedy. When Jean finished, there was silence in the room. The girl thought that once again she had made a mistake, and it would have been better if she had kept quiet. "Everyone can go to their desks, but let Miss May stay." David's words startled the girl. "But why?" Marie asked. "Because all you're offering is nothing but a pile of garbage," replied David to her. David and Jean sat in complete silence. David motioned for the girl to come closer to him. "You're sitting so far away from me, I get the impression that I want to eat you." David explained the reason for his request. The girl got up from the table and moved closer to David. Jean was uncomfortable. She was so worried that she got tangled up in her own legs. "I can't understand what you're embarrassed about, since we've seen each other naked," David told her with a smirk. Once again, memories flashed through Jean's mind. She remembered how they had entered the room. She suggested David look around while she showered. "Why?" David didn't understand. "You've got it all wrong?" The girl tried to explain to him. She said the weather was hot today. In addition, it was windy, consequently quite dusty. She simply wanted to wash her face. "Well then, come back soon or I'll be bored," said David and picked up a can of beer. Already in the shower, Jean began to realize the mistake she was making. She had called a stranger to her room and offered him a drink. What could he possibly think of her? "I must be crazy," said the girl to her reflection, grabbing her head with her hands. She realized she was upset about her boyfriend cheating on her, but it wasn't the right thing to do. While the girl was in the shower, David managed to drink 3 beers. Jean came into the room and suggested that David take a shower as well. "Why?" Once again, David didn't understand her. The girl answered him that it would make him feel fresher. David said okay, he would take her advice. Jean, deep down, hoped that he would still refuse the offer. With his decision, he surprised her. After David showered, they grabbed some salted fish and a can of beer each. The couple made themselves comfortable on the bed. Gina once again opened up to David. She told how pain and resentment had driven her to come to Paris. Gina hoped that the beauty of the city would help her forget about the affair. David listened to Jean in silence. She thought he was a pretty good listener, and quite nice. Jean moved over to David and began to study his face. She admitted to him that she thought his eyes were quite enticing. Jean touched her palm to David's face, which caused him genuine surprise. Damn, she's drunk off her ass, David thought to himself. I guess because I'm so comfortable with you, I want you. Looking into David's eyes, Jean admitted. Let's kiss, the girl asked him. David told her that he didn't like such jokes at all, to which the girl replied to him that she wasn't joking at all, but was being serious. I'll do it, won't I? Said the girl, moving closer and closer to David. All right, go ahead, said David, and also moved closer to the girl. David kissed Jean passionately on her lips. The girl got scared and asked David to stop. She started pushing him away from her with her hands. David suggested the girl to lie down so he could help her relax. David laid the girl on her back and leaned over her. He kissed her on the lips again. And remember, I won't stop until I finish what I started, David warned. He told her that if she wanted, they could end it all right now, because there would be no going back from here. Their hearts were pounding frantically. Jean wrapped her arms around David's neck. She told him that he could do whatever he wanted to her, since she liked it. I, on the other hand, won't like it if you stop. You make sure you pick up Victoria and visit your mom. She's waiting for you, said Dennis into the phone. David answered him that he would do his best. David asked Dennis to get some milk and donuts for dinner, to which Dennis remarked that he was not an errand boy. In the hallway, Denise spotted Jean. The elevator signaled that it had arrived at their floor, but Jean didn't react to it in any way. Dennis approached her and asked if she was going to get into the elevator or stay here. The girl hurriedly entered the elevator. She thanked Dennis, telling him that she had fallen asleep a little while waiting for the elevator. Dennis pointed out that one should sleep at home, not in the hallways. And this one is yours? What do you call him? Well, Victoria's dad. Gina began her question. She was very curious, but she didn't know the right way to ask. Or should I call him your partner? Dennis didn't like hearing that he was considered gay, but he didn't want to have to explain to everyone why they were living together either. So he suggested calling David just a friend. Your friend probably works a lot? I just never see you two together. What do you work as? Jean asked him. Dennis answered her that yes, his friend works a lot and Dennis himself is a doctor by profession. Jim was surprised to hear that Dennis works as a doctor. She admitted that he looked quite intelligent. She thought he worked as a teacher or a librarian. Exiting the elevator, Jane hurried to say goodbye to Dennis, but he stopped her. Don't call me neighbor anymore. Just call me by my first name. My name is Dennis, he asked Jean. He gave Jean a business card and told her that the clinic he works at specializes in liposuction. They also perform plastic surgery. Jean stopped him, saying that she was under the impression that he was inviting her to visit their clinic and use their services. Dennis realized how ridiculous it looked from the outside and told Jean that she was just imagining things. He didn't mean anything by it. Dennis said that he had developed a habit of advertising the clinic's services to everyone. Jean replied that she was an employee herself, so she understood as well as anyone. Dennis apologized for boring Jean and wished her a good evening. Jean replied that she wished him the same. By the way, neighbor, did you know that when you get something from others, you have to give something in return? Jean turned to Dennis. She didn't understand what he was implying. He saw the incomprehension in her eyes and said that he had said his name, so he wanted to hear hers as well. David walked to the door, a bouquet in his hands. They were her favorite flowers. David berated himself for keeping this feeling inside him. He realized that the further it went, the more it would hurt. He called again. The woman in the apartment called his name loudly. Victoria ran up to the open door. "Daddy's here!" she shouted. "Sorry, Mom, I'm late," he said, holding out the bouquet to the woman. She hugged him and cried. "Why did it take you so long to come to me? You have no idea how much I missed you. I kept waiting for you and you never came." The woman continued. David didn't want to admit to his mother that he could still hear her scent. It seemed to him that a young girl with long blonde hair was about to come running towards him. She would call his name excitedly, happy that he had come home. He talked himself into forgetting her face, but he couldn't do it. David glanced in the rearview mirror to see if Victoria was properly buckled in. The girl was yawning. She was clearly sleepy. He turned to her and told her that if she wanted to sleep, she could safely tuck herself in. The girl looked at David and asked why he was crying. He told her that it was nothing like that. Everything was fine. David asked Victoria to go to bed, and the fact that he was crying, she just imagined it. The girl reached up and touched David's face. "I'm the one who should be crying, not you," said the girl, looking David in the eyes. David realized that it was almost impossible to hide his emotions from the child. After Victoria's words, David could no longer hold back his feelings. He had already started crying for real, not hiding his emotions. David realized that with his vivid emotions, he could scare the child. He quickly pulled himself together, turned to Victoria, and told her that he wouldn't cry anymore. He also asked her not to cry either, and not to blame herself for anything. "Victoria, you look so much like your mother," David whispered softly. While David put Victoria to bed and took a shower, Denise grabbed a bottle of cognac and a couple glasses. When David entered the room, Denise told him to sit down as they needed to talk. Denise asked David if he had seen their new neighbor. David admitted to him that he hadn't had a chance to see her yet. "So," Denise began his conversation, "she looked me over at first, and then asked me what she should call you. She didn't know if you were my husband or just a friend. Which one of us is the active, and which one of us is the passive?" Denise decided to make a joke. David grinned at him and then said he couldn't be a passive. It would hurt his self-esteem. Denise noticed that humor wasn't helping David relax. He asked him to let it go. After all, it's been 3 years. And if he doesn't let her go, she won't get to a better place, and so will be left to suffer here. So let her be happy in a better place. A crying Victoria entered the room. She told him that she had a terrible dream. Dennis called her to his arms. The girl said that in the dream, a monster came out of the closet. And next to her was Daddy David and cried for a long time. David began to comfort the little girl. He said that everything she had dreamed wasn't really true. He told Victoria that if she wanted to cry, let her cry. He would let her cry this time. Jean hurried to her workplace. She heard a man's voice calling her. She turned around to see him. It was Bernard calling her. He took her by the shoulders and asked her to talk to him. He wanted the girl to just listen to him. "I have nothing to talk to you about at all," shouted Jean loudly, pushing his hands away. Jean hurriedly retreated, but Bernard grabbed her by the brush. The girl turned to him and angrily said that this behavior of his was called harassment. Jean said that Bernard had no right to come to her workplace and grab her hands like that. Bernard, however, replied that if she had picked up the phone when he called her, he wouldn't have to grovel and come to her workplace. "What did you expect after what happened? Did you expect me to happily pick up the phone every time you called me? Or did you probably think I'd be happy to see you here?" Jean wrenched her hand away and hurried away. She warned Bernard that if he didn't leave now, she would have to call security. The boy once again disobeyed her. Bernard caught up with her and grabbed her arm. But then Bernard's hand was sharply intercepted by another man's hand. David's loud, menacing voice was heard. He asked Bernard if he had forgotten that he had been warned not to bother Jean again. Bernard howled in pain, and David continued, "I'm warning you again. If you call my fiancé or come here, you're out of luck." Jean was surprised to see the editor-in-chief. She was also embarrassed that he had to save her once again. Seeing Jean's confusion, David decided to wink at her. "Do you want me to break your arm?" David asked Bernard. Bernard turned to Jean and mumbled, "How quickly you got a fiancé. You and I have only been apart for 4 months and you're already engaged. You're kind of windy. You've changed your mind too quickly." The girl was indignant at such words. She turned to Bernard and poked her finger at him. She said that Bernard didn't even stop Bernard from cheating, even though they had been together for over 5 years. And now he's calling her windy. David turned to Jean and looked at her with tenderness in his eyes. He told Bernard that he was grateful to him because if it wasn't for him, David wouldn't have met his beloved Jean. "My love, even though Bernard helped us meet, I still don't think it's a good idea to talk to him for so long. Otherwise, people might think you two have something in common." "Do you want your death?" Bernard asked David menacingly. David doubted that Bernard would get anywhere with that plan. He told Bernard that he didn't think the man was a man at all. David took Jean's hand and led her deeper into the building. On the way, he reprimanded her. David said he didn't like petty people at all, and she decided to make a scene right in the middle of the lobby. He warned Jean that they came here to work, not to have fun. "Hey, where are you going?" shouted Bernard to them Wednesday. He ran before them and grabbed David's shoulder, turning him around to face him. David threw his hand off his shoulder and said, "I see you're not very bright. I'll explain it again for the dumb ones." David leaned down to Bernard's ear and whispered, "Get lost. You look pathetic." Bernard led Jean towards the elevator, leaving a surprised-looking Bernard behind him. Jean wanted to pull her hand out of David's palm, but he wouldn't let her. David said she should continue to hold his hand as Bernard looked in their direction. Only when they entered the elevator did David let go of Jean's hand. She thanked him once again for saving her, but asked him not to interfere anymore as she wanted to handle everything herself. David told the surprised girl not to be deceived. After all, everything he was doing downstairs in the lobby, he wasn't doing it for her. "I just want a free drink," David added without turning his head in her direction. Finally, David looked at her. The girl stood silent without saying a word. He asked her why she refused, because in Paris she was not afraid to invite a stranger to her room. The girl answered him that she agreed to his proposal. David said that he would choose the place and time himself, additionally informing her about it a little later. "But I think it will most likely be tonight after work. I want to invite you to a gay bar." There was no limit to the girl's surprise. Seeing the girl's rounded eyes, David said that this was the place where he could relax and do whatever he wanted. The girl asked David if he was one of those, to which David parried that he is not gay at all. Just in this bar, a man can do whatever he wants, even let tears flow, and no one would judge him for it. It was Gina's first time in a gay bar. There was quite a large number of men in the room. Jean noticed that most of them were staring in her direction. She asked David why that was so, to which he replied that the men simply perceived her as a competitor. That sure is some self-esteem, Jean thought to herself. Jean asked David how often he frequents an establishment like this. David answered her that only twice a year. Jean admitted to David that since Paris, he had changed a lot. Whereas he used to answer no comment, today he answers all of her questions. I guess it's because tomorrow is Hagrid's birthday, David thought to himself. The day before this date, he was changing in character, becoming not like himself at all. Usually on this day, David felt empty, but he tried to hide it from Jean. He pretended that nothing was going on, that his heart was not filled with pain, that he was fine. And to be honest with himself, he invited her distraction. "Editor-in-Chief, I noticed that you don't have any friends at all, is that true?" David was snapped out of his musings by Jean's voice. "You know, back in Paris, I noticed that you like to create very uncomfortable questions." David opened up to Jean. Jean decided to explain herself. She said that usually only close friends were invited for a drink, and he called her. If you take away some of the moments from the past, they are total strangers to each other. David told her that first of all, she doesn't know why he's like this tonight. And secondly, he's just comfortable with her. And he actually happens to be normal. He can even smile. Thought with sadness in Jin's eyes. Jean experienced tenderness in her heart, so she touched her palm to David's face. "I see you're drunk again," said David. "Excuse me, but I don't intend to do anything with you tonight," said David to her face, removing his hand from her face. Jean said that back then in Paris, she seduced David on purpose. But today, she has nothing like that in her plans. She just wants to support him morally. "I don't know why, but I feel like today is the day you need me more than ever." David was pleased by Jane's concern. He kissed her hand. This surprised the girl slightly, something she hadn't expected from the editor-in-chief. Seeing the surprise in the girl's eyes, David said that's what everyone does in Europe. Men kiss the hands of ladies as a sign of gratitude. Gina was awakened again by the ringing of the alarm clock. She felt tired and sleep-deprived. She was also wondering if the editor-in-chief had gotten home okay yesterday. The girl walked David to the car. He asked her if she really wanted to ride along with him. No, you didn't. I was just walking you out." The girl felt wrecked. She had a bad headache. She went out into the hallway and called the elevator. "And here we meet again," a smiling Dennis told her. He was holding Victoria in his arms. "Well, where's your boyfriend again?" "Oh, I forgot. We agreed to call him friend," said Jean, stepping into the elevator. "He drank a lot last night. Now he's sleeping it off," Dennis admitted. The girl laughed and said that if Dennis didn't hurry to wake him up, his friend would obviously be late for work. Dennis replied to her that they don't meddle in each other's affairs. Everyone lives the life they want to live, to which Jean replied that they were that couple. Denise offered to give Jean a ride to her work. The girl said she didn't need to since she had her own car. Looking at her, Dennis thought maybe he should ask her out. Dennis got a call from David at work. He was angry that his friend hadn't woken him up before he left. Now he was going to make him late for work. Dennis hung up the phone and looked at the calendar. That's right, this is the day David gets really drunk. The editor-in-chief's office was noisy. The staff was discussing the latest news, solving work issues. The editor-in-chief wasn't there yet. "Do you know what stunning news I've learned?" Stephen asked his staff. It turns out that our editor-in-chief is the son of our president. It was now clear to Jean why David had left a more prestigious job to come to their humble magazine. He would probably be the next president. I don't know. I still think our editor-in-chief shouldn't have left his last job. He would have become president of our magazine anyway, ranted Stephen, not noticing David standing behind him. And actually, if it wasn't for his mommy being president of the magazine, he probably wouldn't be so arrogant. Continued to bury himself, Stephen. He's certainly handsome, but still. Jean even started waving her hands in front of Stephen, only to be silenced. David leaned against the wall to keep Stephen from speaking. The guy was telling him that his hair had started falling out lately due to stress. Their boss is too strict. So maybe I should just buy you some hair loss shampoo? David finally raised his voice. Stephen almost howled in surprise. Listen to me. I figured you'd have something to say to me. You know, Stephen, what's interesting is that I didn't know my mom was president myself. Thanks for telling me, said David, leaning over Stephen. And you really think that right now I can barge into the president's office and simply call her mom? You know, Stephen, I don't actually care. You can gossip behind your boss's backs for hours, but it should in no way reflect on your job, said David, adjusting Stephen's shirt collar. David then turned to a frightened Jean and asked her to come into his office. When Jean entered the editor-in-chief's office, David had his back to her. He was looking at the things spread out on the desk. Jean stepped closer to him and asked why he called her in to see him. David asked the girl if the photo shoot with the fireman was all set. He also asked her to just stand steady next to him. David slipped the fur coat over Jean's shoulders, picked out earrings from a set. David put the earrings to Jean's ear and said it looked pretty nice. David said that in the December issue he wants to use this combination. He asked Jean what she thought about it. Jean suggested inviting the deputy editor into the office. When David asked why, she replied that she was the one to handle issues of this nature. David sat down at the table and told Jean that he didn't understand why she was showing weakness, why she is afraid to go against her superiors. He said that if she had been in the interview, she would have failed it immediately. David went on to say that a career as editor-in-chief is something she should forget about. What could she offer her readers with that attitude? Forget what we talked about, though. You can go back to your desk. Jean bowed her head for a bow and hurried away. Today her boss was not like that guy from Paris or that interlocutor from the gay bar. Already at home, to take her mind off work a little, Jean decided to make dessert for herself. Victoria was crying hard again. Dennis ran into her room to check what was wrong. He took her hands and touched her forehead. It was hot. The baby had a fever. Jean was awakened by the doorbell ringing. It was late, and she didn't realize who needed her at this hour. She went to the door to see who the person was, her late visitor. When Jean opened the door, she saw an agitated Dennis on the doorstep. He was holding a sleeping Victoria in his arms. I know it's too late, but could you give us a ride to the hospital? Dennis asked her. It turned out that the girl had tonsillitis she needed to get an IV. Victoria was the daughter of his dead sister, Hangrid. She was a single mom and wanted to raise her daughter on her own. Dennis had promised at her funeral to do his best to make Victoria a decent person. David arrived at the hospital. As soon as he saw Dennis, he immediately inquired about Victoria's health and well-being. David noticed that Dennis's hands were shaking. He asked him how he had made it all the way to the hospital with those hands. Dennis admitted that he'd had to ask a neighbor for help. Dennis asked David why it had taken him so long to get home from work and where he had been all that time. David replied that he didn't have to report to him, much less ask him what he should do. Dennis told him that he didn't understand at all why he was raising Victoria on his own. After all, that was not what David had promised him. You promised me that we would raise the girl together. Why are you now covering yourself with your work? I work too, and I'm tired too. I'm wrong, I know that. I'm a bad person. David admitted his wrongness. You know I'm a doctor. I've seen a lot, and I thought I was pretty cool-headed. But as soon as something happened with Victoria, I immediately lost control of myself. Dennis admitted. David tried to comfort his friend. He knew that the man loved his sister dearly and was worried about her daughter. David told Dennis to calm down, because it was just tonsillitis, and in addition, the girl was already under the care of doctors. To comfort his friend, David took his friend's hand. I can't believe it's late Saturday night, holding your hand instead of clutching my lover's hands in my palms. David smiled. With a clatter, 2 metal cans of energy drink fell to the floor and rolled to David's feet. Jean stared at them with wide-open eyes. Her editor-in-chief was sitting in the hospital holding Dennis's hand. She asked him what on earth he was doing here. Dennis turned to David and asked if he knew their neighbor. The comicality of the situation began to dawn on David. We sure look like 2 gay men right now, David thought to himself. Editor-in-chief, are you bisexual? Jean couldn't resist asking. David and Jean went outside to talk. Jean, David began. The girl raised her hand and said he shouldn't report to her. They had only slept together once, so she didn't care about his orientation. David could see that Jean was very angry. He realized that the girl didn't like the fact that while in a relationship, he slept with another woman. He thought with sorrow in his heart that she was about to start telling him off. What pisses me off is the fact that you hid from me that you were in a relationship. You said you had no one. Jean began her angry dialogue. Your friend Dennis will be extremely upset when he finds out that you were having an affair on the side. I've been cheated on. I know how much it hurts. Of course, I could keep quiet and pretend it never happened in Paris. But I wouldn't do it for you. I'd do it for Victoria. You think you're above all the people around you, but you're really at the bottom. Jean continued to rage. Jean calmed David down. She told him that he could take it easy on the rumors. She knows how to keep her mouth shut and won't say anything to anyone. David looked intently into the girl's face and she continued. It's only for the sake of your friend Dennis that I will continue to talk to you in a normal way. You're all proper, Miss May. I don't understand how your ex-boyfriend couldn't see that. How could he walk away from you? Bringing his face close to Jean's, David said. Walking away, the girl said that she would not be seeing him alone from now on. David called out to the girl. He said, what right does she have to say her opinion to a person's face like that, and then just walk away? Denise is only a friend to him, a family member. And the fact that they are raising Victoria together means nothing. If you don't believe my words now, that's personally your problem, said David to Jean's face. David started to take his cloak off of himself. He said he thought of a way to prove to Jean the truthfulness of his words. David put his cloak on the girl's shoulders. Jean was outraged. She decided that her boss was trying to woo her, trying to simply bore her. David said it was late and she should go home. He gave her his raincoat so she wouldn't catch cold. He wants all his employees to be healthy. Denise asked if David was able to straighten out the situation with the neighbor. Dennis demanded that David tell the neighbor the whole truth. He was tired of everyone thinking he was gay, and he had been asking David for a long time to make some kind of impact on the situation. And what do you suggest? To every person who knocks on our door say, hello, we're not gay. David decided to guffaw. I don't know what you'll do or say, but our neighbor needs to know that we are not a couple, spoke his opinion to Dennis. David said he didn't understand what his friend was trying to accomplish. Do you want everyone in the house to know that we are not a couple or just our neighbor? David asked Denise. David asked why the friend was starting to care about their neighbor's opinion. The doorbell rang. Denise asked David if David was living with someone to visit. David answered in the negative. Dennis saw the uninvited guest on the intercom screen. He turned to his friend and said that was it. Now they had a problem. Brother Hans is here to see us. With some excitement in his voice, Dennis said. Hans was a lawyer and David's part-time brother. The man was dangerous in anger. Nu was the only one who could put David in his place. Hey, why didn't you tell us you were coming? We would have been prepared. Trying to feign joy on his face and in his voice, Dennis. Hans handed Dennis the meat bag and walked into the room. Why the hell did he come here? Dennis thought sadly. Hello, my dear brother, said David, getting up from behind the desk. Well, here's where you're hiding, rat boy, and I've been looking for you, Hans replied in his tone. I'm sorry, Hans, that I didn't warn you of my return from France. David began to justify himself to Hans. Hans replied to him that he didn't accept any excuses, that his brother now owed him 100 push-ups or he would be beaten. While David was doing push-ups to Dennis's loud counting, Hans decided to pay attention to Victoria. He hadn't seen her in a while, so he missed her a lot. In the evening, a large, noisy group of them decided to have dinner. Jean realized that she had baked quite a lot of macaroons, so she decided to share some of it with her neighbors. She went to apartment number 1003 and rang the bell. Okay, now it turns out they're not gay. The rumors were unfounded. But then why does David go to a gay bar? Is that really what men do? All of these thoughts kept Jean on her toes. The door was opened by David. He was dressed homemade, wearing a hoodie and sweatpants. Seeing her this evening, he hadn't expected to see her at all. "Miss May, did something happen at work today, Sunday?" David asked her. The girl replied that nothing was wrong. She just wanted to treat them to dessert. "Oh, did you make them yourself?" asked David to the girl. Jean replied that yes, and just so he knows, making desserts is her hobby. The girl gave David the macaroons and was about to leave, but he called out to her. David invited the girl to have dinner with them. "And this is our good neighbor. Her name is Jean." David introduced the girl to his brother Hans. Hans asked the girl what it was like to be his brother's subordinate, although she might not answer because he knows David too well. "Here, Jean, help yourself," said Dennis, and held out a plate of food to the girl. David noticed that his friend was trying to woo Jean. In a displeased tone, he said that Jean decided to treat them all to dessert. "That's so great! Do you guys really know how to do that too?" Dennis asked with a smile. "That's great that you decided to treat us to macaroons because that's my favorite dessert." "That's strange, you always said you couldn't stand macaroons and don't understand the taste of them at all," David pointed out loudly. "Listen, have you guys ever heard of the competitive spirit?" Hans asked the boys. David said how could one not know such a thing. He handed Jean a glass of water for her to drink some. Dennis asked Hans why he remembered that and handed Jean another plate of food, to which he replied that they would soon figure it out for themselves. Jean looked at the resulting pictures of the firefighters. She didn't like the result. She wanted the firefighters to be captured against the backdrop of a real fire during their difficult work. She wanted to capture the full range of emotions. She argued to the photographer that she wanted to convey a different message. Firefighters experience the same emotions as the average person. They can also panic during a fire, feel fear. She wanted to capture the fatigue on the models' faces. The photographer noted with weariness in his voice that they were a fashion magazine, and realistic photos with tired people could be seen in news reports. The girl realized that she was powerless. The photographer did not want to hear her at all, so this situation pissed her off wildly. "Why don't you want to do what you're asked? After all, that's what we pay you money for." Jean and the photographer heard a calm male voice beside them. David Sheen, the editor-in-chief, entered the studio. David was quite angry. He told the photographer to do his job properly, not to deviate from the set concept. After all, the plan for this photo shoot had been approved by his superiors, and how this photo shoot would look like, the photographer could not decide. David looked at the photos and said they were terrible. They needed to be redone immediately. Jean noted to herself that David reminds her of a poisonous snake. He speaks in a calm voice at the beginning, as if curled up in rings, then makes a throw, begins to scowl and shout insulting things. The photo shoot lasted longer than Jean expected, so the girl was very tired. She went outside to take a little break. In her pants pocket, the phone vibrated. It was Bernard again. The girl decided not to answer it. She put the phone in her pants pocket. "You still don't want to answer my phone calls?" said Bernard, appearing next to her. "F***K, how many times can you do this? You're stalking me again. What are you doing here?" the girl shouted angrily. Bernard told her that he was passing by and saw her, so he decided to talk to her. Bernard noticed the tiredness in the girl's eyes. He extended his hand to her and offered to go with him to a small, cozy restaurant. The girl refused. Jean turned her back to Bernard and hurried away. The guy touched her hand and said that he had already broken up with his girlfriend. He wants to get Jean back again. At some point, Jean realized that she was tired of being strong. She was tired of hiding her feelings and emotions. She couldn't cross Bernard out of her heart. She had been dating him for more than 5 years. The girl turned to the guy, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Are you crying?" Bernard asked her. "Yes, but don't think it's because of you. I'm just having a rough day." Jean answered him. The squealing of wheels was heard. Bernard and Jean turned at the sound. A car was speeding towards the couple. The car hit Bernard and he fell to the ground. David got out of the car. David walked over to Bernard and jerked him up off the ground. "I'm sorry, please. Unfortunately, I'm not good at driving a car," David said in a calm, quiet voice. Bernard didn't believe him. He started yelling that he ran over him on purpose. "David is a real asshole. A crazy lunatic. And you're not smart at all. I'm telling you, if you keep messing with my girlfriend, you're risking your health," David replied. David threw his business card in Bernard's direction. He told him to go to the hospital to get checked out. David promised to pay all the bills. David grabbed Jean's hand and pulled her toward the car. Before getting into the car, David turned to Bernard and said that he wouldn't brake next time. "You're crazy! A true asshole!" shouted the trail of the departing car to Bernard. In the car, Jean thanked David again for his help. She reminded him that she had asked him not to interfere. She would take care of her own problems. David told Jean to forget about what had happened as soon as possible. "It's okay." Jean asked David where he was taking her. David suggested that she go somewhere to eat. "Are you suggesting I eat with you?" In a stammering voice, Jean asked. "Are you so afraid of me that you've started stuttering?" David asked her with a smirk. "No, what makes you think I'm afraid of you?" Jean tried to pull herself together. "By the way, Miss May, I have a question for you. Why do you run away every time after you eat?" Jin said that there was nothing wrong and stopped reminding her about that incident. "Also, Miss May, why didn't you return my cloak?" David asked. The girl got embarrassed and admitted that she simply forgot about it. "You and I are neighbors, so bring it in. It costs quite a bit," asked David. David opened the doors wide and walked into the restaurant. The waiter greeted him cheerfully. Jean realized that David was a frequent guest here. The waiter asked David who the nice lady next to her was. "Could it be a girl?" "Does it look like one?" asked David. David admitted to the waiter that Jean was just his co-worker and nothing more. David asked if she still thought he was bisexual. The girl inquired, was that really the only reason he'd brought her to lunch? David told Jean that he wanted to prove to her that he only liked girls. David admitted to Jean that he doesn't care what people say about him, and even if they think he's gay, that's their problem. But in the case of Jean, this situation irritates him. When David was 10 years old, his parents died in a car accident. His mom's friend at the funeral promised to look after the boy. After all, David's mom was like a sister to her, like a close relative. Mom invited David over to her house to celebrate his arrival. She asked him to come as soon as he had a spare minute. David couldn't refuse her. David's doors were opened to David by Denise. He immediately lashed out at his friend for showing up so late. David replied to him that he was in an important meeting that he couldn't cancel. Upon seeing David, his mom shouted loudly, "My pretty boy is here!" Hans, who was standing nearby, was indignant. "What a pretty boy! David is a big man!" David hugged his mom and said that in her eyes he would always be a little boy. His wife Samantha appeared next to Hans. She rebuked David for making everyone wait for him. Samantha moved closer to David and said hello to him by the hand. She noted to herself that he was still handsome. A flicker of regret flashed inside her that she hadn't met David sooner than Hans. David was approached by his father. He was also pleased to see him. He remarked that David had become even more stately and mature during his absence. Mom invited everyone to the table. At the table, the conversation about Victoria came up. Father asked Dennis if they had enough money to educate the little girl. Dennis replied that yes, it was fine. After all, it was your sister's wish for the child to have a good education, the father remarked with bitterness in his voice. Before heading home after dinner, David decided to stop by the office. He had some business to take care of there. The lights were on in the office, which surprised him a little. After all, everyone should have gone home by now. Sitting at her desk was Jean. David decided to go over to her and see why she was here so late. David walked right up to her, but the girl couldn't hear him. She had her headphones on. Is she listening to heavy metal that she can't hear anything around her? David thought to himself. While the girl didn't notice him, David decided to look at her. Back in Paris, he had noticed that Jean had long black eyelashes, like a doll's. David remembered how he had seen the girl on her first day on the job. First of all, she was late for work. Second, she looked rather unkempt. But now he realized that the girl enjoyed doing her job. She was enthusiastic. David pulled the headphones out of Jean's ears. Jean finally noticed the editor-in-chief next to her. She also wondered what he was doing here so late. David admitted to the girl that he had been sitting beside her for over 10 minutes, and she hadn't noticed him. He complimented her on her focus. David asked the girl if she had long left to work. Jean said no, she was almost done. David offered her a drink, but not as colleagues, but as acquaintances. They decided to have a drink in his office. The girl was a little embarrassed by the situation. She asked David if it was normal for them to drink in the office. David said, pulling off his tie, that the workday was over so they wouldn't have a problem. David noticed that the girl hardly touched alcohol at all. He said he didn't like to drink alone. Jean replied that now she wanted to listen to his stories. After all, back then in Paris, it was more her talking than him. David held out his hand to the girl and said there was no need for any talking. He asked her to comfort him. The girl got up from behind her seat and came close to David. She berated herself for her weakness, but she liked this man. David covered his eyes, thus showing the girl that he was ready for a kiss. Jean took David's head with her hands and leaned toward him. "How can I comfort you?" Jean whispered. She leaned over David and kissed him passionately on the lips. David grabbed the girl's hand and pulled her sharply toward him. David sat Jean down in a chair and hovered over her himself. He now leaned over the girl and kissed her passionately on the lips as well. Denise had been calling David all evening, but he didn't pick up the phone. It was getting late, but the friends still hadn't come home. Dennis was worried about that. Dennis heard someone trying to open the door with a key, but he was having no luck. What a half-wit. How can you not get the key in the keyhole? Dennis thought to himself. He figured it was David coming back. The boy hurried to open the door. He saw a smiling Jean, who was holding a drunken David. Jean admitted that she hadn't rung the doorbell because she was afraid of waking Victoria. She tried to open the door on her own. Jean told Dennis that she had considered bringing David to her house, but she was afraid of gossip, since she was a lonely girl. Dennis took David away from the girl and asked the girl where they had managed to get so drunk. Dennis told the girl that David doesn't usually get very drunk. This is the first time he's seen him in this condition. "I'm sorry, Dennis. It may be unseemly to ask such a thing, but it's important for me to know," the girl started to say. "You probably want to know if David and I are dating?" Dennis beat her to the punch with a question. "You know, if David and I were a couple, we would definitely break up after this." Denise decided to make a joke. Denise told her that no, they weren't a couple. He wouldn't break up with his friend because he needed him. Dennis said goodnight to the girl and locked the door. In the morning, leaving the apartment, Jean saw David in the hallway. The girl walked closer to him and said hello. "How did you sleep?" David asked. Jean noticed that David was quite relaxed, so she figured he probably didn't remember anything about the previous evening. David asked Jean if she was the one who had dragged him home. "Definitely doesn't remember anything. And that's his boasted photographic memory. You said yourself that he'd look at a picture once and he'd remember it all right away." Jean was indignant. "You don't remember anything at all?" Jean asked David. David asked what Jean was implying. Does she want him to remember the whole evening or some part of it? David and Gin stepped into the elevator. "What am I supposed to do now? Pretend I don't remember anything either?" Jean thought to herself. As they exited the elevator, David turned to the girl and called her name. Jean looked up at him. "You know, I liked it even better this time than I did in Paris." Looking the girl in the eye, David said. Jean looked embarrassed. Jean sat on a chaise lounge and inflated balloons. She asked Stephen to help her inflate the balloons. The guy said that inflating balloons with your mouth like that is pretty silly. Stephen suggested that she go buy a pump. While the girl was inflating the balloons, Stephen decided to gossip again. He asked if she knew what their editor-in-chief's nickname was. "Desert Taipan, pretty cool, huh? I came up with that one myself," the guy said excitedly. Jean thought he and Stephen had the same thoughts. "And it suits him," the girl thought to herself. "I've actually been thinking about his nickname for a long time. At first I wanted to call him Mad Dog, or Mega Brain." Stephen went on to tell her. The boy was once again so engrossed in the conversation that he didn't notice the supervisor behind him. Jean tried to signal him with her eyes, but Stephen didn't see it. Finally, the guy turned around and saw the editor-in-chief. "I noticed that you have a lot of complaints about my work," David started to say. Stephen tried to justify himself. David stopped him firmly. He said that if the guy wanted to change jobs, he would be sure to write him a letter of recommendation. "Miss May, am I right in thinking that if a man doesn't like something about his job, he should change it?" David turned to Jean. "There, he's picking on me too." Jean thought to herself. She tried to be inconspicuous, but she failed miserably. "So am I right or am I wrong?" Leaning over, Jean interrogated David. There was nothing left to do but answer that yes, he was right. "Then you can stay to work for us, Miss May. Now Stephen will be in charge of the balloons." David said this and left. Stephen was upset. He told Jean that the editor-in-chief hated him, that now he would take revenge on him. People slowly started to pull up to the party. Gina was standing on the sidelines sipping a cocktail. Suddenly 2 guys approached her. They decided to meet the girl. Jean told them that she was the organizer of the event. She cannot just take and enjoy a vacation, she is at work. The young men handed her a cocktail. The girl thanked them for their concern. apologized, and hurried away. Jessica ran up to Jean. She asked the girl to bring her questionnaire. It was left in her car. Jessica handed Jean the keys to her car. Finding the car she needed, Jean opened the back door. She found the questionnaire packet and hurried to the elevator. When the elevator doors opened, Jean saw those two guys from the party. The guys didn't get off the elevator. They suggested that Jin return to the event with them. The guys admitted that the girl had caught their attention. They were interested in her. Since the girl needed to get to the party, she entered the elevator. Jean didn't come back for a long time. Jessica was nervous as she badly needed the questionnaire. She started dialing Jean's number, but she didn't pick up. Jessica, burning with indignation, hurried to the parking lot. She decided she would take the questionnaire herself. The editor-in-chief was walking toward her. David asked Jessica why she was so excited, what had happened. She had to admit that she forgot the questionnaire in the car. David said that Jessica was needed here at the event, so he would bring her the questionnaire himself. Jessica admitted that she had already sent John for the questionnaire, but the girl, for some reason, hasn't returned in a long time. One guy grabbed Jean from behind and dragged her to the car. The other brought John's head close and said she should have gone straight with them instead of pulling out. Jean tried to scream, but the guy who was holding her tightly clamped his hand over her mouth. A big, strong fist flew into the face of the guy in red. He fell to the ground. "What the hell? Who the hell are you?" loudly howled the guy who was holding Jean tightly against him. "Well, finally," Jean thought to herself. "Here I found you," said David, looking at Jean. As David was focusing his gaze on Jean, he missed the punch to his left. Jean didn't wake up until she was in the hospital. Standing next to her bed was David. He had a busted lip. Seeing the injury, Jean asked David what happened to his mouth. Jean asked David what were those guys, what did they want? David covered her with a blanket and told her not to worry, she should rest. She could still file a report against them. Jean needed a lawyer to sort out the case. David suggested her brother Hans. Jean was worried that she wouldn't have enough money for such a great lawyer. Hans assured her that he would charge her a token amount. Jean was embarrassed by that. She didn't want to owe him. Hans said that this was his way of thanking Jean for looking after his two idiot brothers. Hans also noted that the girl reminded him a lot of his sister Hangrid. Jean was awakened by a knock on the door. Standing outside the door was David. He had grocery bags in his hands. The girl was surprised to see him. David said that the girl must not have had dinner. He held out the bag of food to her. David also added that if the girl was still not feeling well, she could stay home tomorrow. Jean replied him that she was feeling fine, so she would definitely go to work tomorrow. David started to leave, but the girl called out to him. She suggested that he come over to visit her. "To visit you? But why?" David asked her in surprise. "You brought me food, and I don't like to eat alone," explained Jean. Looking at his watch, David said okay. He had some time. At the table, the girl thanked David again for bringing her food. David sat and just watched Jean eat. "Why are you looking at me like that?" the girl asked him embarrassedly. David didn't answer her anything. To avoid sitting in silence, the girl also said thank you to David for helping her with her lawyer. David replied to her that she was in trouble, and he just decided to help. That's what anyone would do if they were him. "You know, Hans said I look a lot like his sister," Jean admitted. David stood up abruptly from the table and hurried toward the exit. Jean didn't realize what was going on, what she could have done to offend him. "Did I say something wrong?" John shouted after him. David came to the playground where he often liked to sit with his sister. David remembered how he and Hangrid had talked about his marriage. He loved his sister dearly and always wanted his future wife to be like her. David never admitted to his adoptive parents that he loved their daughter. They had accepted him as a son, so he perceived Hangrid as his sister. And it was unlikely his foster parents would have accepted such a relationship. The phone rang. It was Dennis. He asked if David had time to drop off Jean's food. David said not to expect him. He would be home late. David hung up the phone and remembered his meeting with Jean in Paris. He had helped her precisely because she reminded him very much of Hangrid. David was absorbed in his thoughts. He didn't notice someone approaching him. Jean leaned over him and asked him if he was all right. The girl admitted that she had been looking for David for a very long time. Jean said that she couldn't leave him in the state in which he ran away from her. She was very worried about him. It was quite chilly outside, so David silently removed his coat and threw it over Jean's shoulders. They rode up the elevator in silence. Already in the hallway, Gina handed David her coat. She asked him never to run away from her again. David silently looked after Jean as she left. This girl struck him to the core. She was so dear, so understanding. At dinner, Dennis asked David if he had noticed that Jean looked like their sister, Hagrid. David replied that he hadn't seen it before, but now he only thought about their resemblance. On top of that, their resemblance was noticed by all the relatives. Jean decided to go back to work. She was already feeling well enough. She walked out into the hallway and headed for the elevator. Standing by the elevator was David. He looked great as always. David admitted that he had been standing there waiting for Jean for a few minutes now. The girl was pleasantly surprised to hear that.